Fitzgerald was an elitist. Fitzgerald was a snob. He fell into the company of Father Fay and Shane Leslie, who only reinforced that aspect of him. And that was a trigger for him when the perception became that the Celt was equal to the Teuton. And interestingly, Fitzgerald used to say he liked the underdog causes. He had a particular attraction to the Confederacy through his father, and that continued. And the way the Irish question was sold to him in a way that the Irish question was also another underdog cause. It's not just the Irishness; it's the Catholicism. So they brought an Eastern elitism, Catholicism. So for the first time, he saw Catholicism as, not dark and dank and, oppressive priests. He saw it as a worldly, intellectual elitist.
That was Patrick O'Sullivan Greene, author of Gatsby, Death of an Irishman, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and His Search for Identity. Hello and welcome to episode 115 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Patrick O'Sullivan Greene is a rare return guest for us at the Irish Baseball Podcast, but we had to have him back when he released this new book. Thanks for being here again, Patrick.
Great to be back again, Rick.
So the first time you were here, you were talking about your book, Crowdfunding the Revolution. If you could talk about that one just very briefly before we get into your most recent book.
Yeah, the crowdfunding revolution was about Michael Collins and the founding of the Irish state, very much focused on the state building activities rather than the military and intelligence activities of Michael Collins, and focusing on his, natural business and marketing skills, which went into fundraising for the fledgling Irish state, and also enabled him to, put in the framework for a national government, all, under the watchful eye of the Dublin Castle administration. That subsequently led to a second book, which we also discussed, Revolution at the Waldorf, which was about Eamon de Valera, not necessarily going to America, but Eamon de Valera arriving into America and the maelstrom of that time, 1919.
Absolutely. Both of them were great conversations. I know in the de Valera book, we had a reference to baseball that we got to in that one because Harry Boland, I believe, was in Cincinnati during the 1919 World Series. And I think coming up later in today's conversation, we're going to get to some baseball as well, because you're always good at picking up those nice little nuggets out of these books. So your most recent piece is Gatsby, Death of an Irishman, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and His Search for Identity. So that's a complicated title. Why don't you get a little bit into the purpose of your book compared to all of the other work on the subject of F. Scott Fitzgerald, where yours is different?
Yeah, I first got into F. Scott Fitzgerald writing Revolution at the Waldorf when I came across a quote in Fitzgerald's first book, This Side of Paradise, in which the main character, Fitzgerald's alter ego, Amory Blaine, says he suspected that being Irish was being somewhat common. And, for me, writing a book in Ireland about Irish America, it was a kind of eye-opener that the story and history and the journey of Irish America, was a difficult one in many cases. And in particular, Scott Fitzgerald, in that line, and reveals an innate shame he had in his Irishness, and that kind of triggered the thought that someday I will do something on Fitzgerald. And I decided to, because I had a lot of the groundwork done in Revolution at the Waldorf, in particular for America in 1919, a very fabulous, intriguing, important year in America. Geopolitically and domestically, politically and economically. I have a lot of groundwork done in Fitzgerald, and I really wanted to trace Fitzgerald's Irishness. And in a way, This Side of Paradise traces Fitzgerald's journey from, initial shame in his Irish background, then through a journey of discovery in his teens, and a rejection again, after World War One, after the flu pandemic. And I wanted to see how that fitted into his creation of Jay Gatsby, or in fact, Jay Gatsby being really Jimmy Gatz from the Midwest, who self-invents into this caricature called Jay Gatsby, this, yellow Rolls Royce driving, this pink shirt wearing, this guy with a Hotel de Ville, quite really ugly, big but ugly mansion, who goes around, saying old sport, which to anybody would have revealed that, he didn't really carry any breeding that he aspired to. And the similarities with Fitzgerald himself, were too obvious. Once you kind of went into the self-invention of Fitzgerald himself.
That is a great explanation of what you're doing here with this book. And I think a lot of us, I mean, you mentioned before we started recording, you mentioned, you read The Great Gatsby when you're 17 or whatever, you read it through school, or, you might not get as much out of it as you do if you go back and read it as an adult. Do you think that what you're providing here with this book, that people will want to, especially Irish people, Irish Americans, will want to go back and read The Great Gatsby again through the looking glass of him being an Irish American?
Yes, I think so. And I've written my book on the basis that you don't have had to have read The Great Gatsby. But it's maybe in a way it's a kind of guide or a lead up to understanding the novel, because on the face of it, it's the least Irish of his novels. There were, none of the protagonists are Irish. There's in one scene, he lists off, 40 or 50 families members who've attended his parties, and within that there were a number of Irish names, but that's it. There is no obvious Irish link to The Great Gatsby. But when you look at Fitzgerald's life, and in particular when he moves to the south of France in 1924 to finish The Great Gatsby, and you look at the journey he's been on himself, it becomes very plain that Fitzgerald's journey of self-invention and Gatsby's journey of self-invention, both which ultimately are self-destructive, are quite, it's the same journey, it's the same person. And Fitzgerald himself, says that in later life, that Gatsby started out as one man I knew, but turned into himself.
And when we talk about a book like The Great Gatsby, and I think it's a real service that you're doing by writing this where you didn't have to have read it before, because I think even those of us who have read it, because maybe we had to read it in school, you don't always have the same capacity to retain that information, right? Like, you read something as an assignment, and sometimes it's a little harder to remember what you read, remember all the significance, because you used it for the test and then you got rid of it. But I think what you're doing with this book is giving people a way to go back or to read it for the first time and just say, this is a different way of looking at it. Obviously, nobody's teacher was talking about that situation, was like, nobody mentioned that he was Irish. I guess I figured it out by his last name, but I never remember that being a part of the conversation. So it is a real service that I think your book is doing here. Could you also get a little bit to that not shame that he felt being Irish, but it definitely was something that when you see a lot of people now, a lot of Irish Americans, and they take pride in their Irish heritage, it was not something that he viewed as being a net positive.
I would use the word shame, certainly in his childhood. So, we associate Scott Fitzgerald mainly with his surname, as being an Irish surname, but his mom was Molly McQuillan, and from a very, as Fitzgerald himself says of the McQuillan, straight 1850 potato famine Irish. So that's on the McQuillan side, and the McQuillans were also Minnesota, so they're northern. On his father's side, the Fitzgerald tried to claim multiple times that he was Irish on one side only, on the McQuillan side, that he wasn't Irish on the Fitzgerald side. And his basis for that, even though you can trace a direct linear path through his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents to the Fitzgeralds, is that the Fitzgeralds arrived before the famine, and the Fitzgeralds arrived into the South. So they had attributed, in his mind, the requirements of being American, colonial. And the Fitzgeralds, his grandfather married Cecilia Ashton Scott, who, although Catholic, was what you might call one of the first Maryland families, with roots stretching back to the 17th century. Again, a colonial heritage that Fitzgerald would have seen as a requirement of being American. And that, the subtitle of my book is that Fitzgerald's search for identity. And from a young age, that's where he tried to assimilate as being American through that colonial heritage, and carrying the shame or the degeneration in his blood of the McQuillan blood. And interestingly, on more than one occasion, he justifies being Irish on one side only, while his Ivy League friends, his Princeton friends, just didn't buy into that at all. And, they saw him as Irish on both sides. And that journey that Fitzgerald went on, he was pretty much raised in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he in a very affluent neighborhood in Summit Avenue. Most of his friends would have been Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and also very rich, whereas the Fitzgeralds had money, but from the McQuillan side, because his grandfather was an extremely successful Irish immigrant who came over in the 1840s, built a very large grocery wholesale business. And I loved his story, Philip F. McQuillan. He sails across the Atlantic. He goes to the Midwest. He's caught up in his early 20s. He's caught up in the pioneering spirit, goes to St. Paul, steams upriver to St. Paul, the last navigable point on the Mississippi. So this is a journey you don't make unless you're ambitious. And, beyond St. Paul is, untamed frontier country. And he does this as a young man and sets up a really well-known, established, successful business, leaves a large inheritance. But by the time Scott is born, that inheritance has dwindled. And his father, ironically and difficult for the man, his father, Edward Fitzgerald, had relocated from Baltimore, Maryland, the South, to Minnesota. And remember, we're still within a generation of the Civil War. And, not only had he really relocated to the North, he was an ineffectual businessman, and a rather ineffectual man in an environment of McQuillan Irish, where, he was quite a dapper individual, and he would have stood out, and being a failure in business also impacted on Scott. His mom, used to go around saying, "Where would we be now without grandfather McQuillan?" adding to the shame on Edward Fitzgerald, Scott's father.
And you mentioned him trying to grasp on to this Americanness, but when I was reading up on him again, getting ready for this interview, there are parts of his background that almost sound like, he's like a Forrest Gump, where he just keeps popping up with some of these like big names through American history that just happen to be a part of his life and his story as he's coming up. His first cousin, twice removed, was Mary Surratt, who was hanged in 1865 for conspiring to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. He served under Dwight Eisenhower in the military. Like, this is somebody who definitely has a foothold in the American story. Like, he is not just an Irishman, he is an Irish American.
Yes, and the link to Eisenhower, is quite tenuous, but the link that F. Scott Fitzgerald focused in particular was that through the Ashton Scotts, he was related to Francis Scott Key. And Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, Fitzgerald and his mom liked to claim that he was, I think, great-granduncle, when in fact he was a second cousin 3 times removed. And, in many ways, Fitzgerald saw that name as the gateway into elite Eastern society. And, he frequently used that as the introduction. And even Shane Leslie, an Anglo-Irish diplomat who kind of became an early mentor to Fitzgerald, when he introduced Fitzgerald to Scribner, the publisher, that was one of the points he made in the introductory letter, that I know this young man, and he's related to Francis Scott Key. So it immediately gives a sense of being part of elite society, of worthy of, at the time, of an introduction.
So as he's trying to make this connection to being American and trying to shed that Irish heritage, as somebody who lives in Ireland and who is in academics, do you find that the Irish take pride in The Great Gatsby and the other works of F. Scott Fitzgerald, or is he definitely viewed over there as almost strictly an American author?
I think the latter. Fitzgerald would be perceived as an American author, and it's the raison d'etre for me writing the book, is just trying to explore more, because there is that part where he has early shame in his Irishness, but in his teens and late teens, he develops a passion for Ireland, both on the on literature side and actually the Irish revolutionary activity, the Irish question. And that's largely due to Shane Leslie, who we mentioned, and to a priest, Father Fay, who became another mentor for Fitzgerald, in particular during his Princeton years. And Shane Leslie wrote a book called The Celt and the World. And this was an eye-opener for Fitzgerald, because all his young life he's been ashamed of his Celticness. And Shane Leslie writes this book, which puts the Celt and the Teuton on an equal racial footing. And Fitzgerald has certain strong racist characteristics. And, he now sees pride in the fact that the Celt is put on an equal level with the Teuton. And he buys into this, and he immerses himself in the Irish literary revival. He's reading Synge, Yeats, Lady Gregory. At one stage, he's going around Princeton quoting Wilde. and, calling Wilde by his very Irish middle name is Fingal O'Flaherty. And so he becomes immersed in his Irishness. He starts answering or signing off letters, God bless you Celtically, and Gaelically yours. And probably most interestingly, he becomes very interested in the Irish question at the time. And he reviews Leslie's The Celt in the World in the Nassau Literary Magazine, in Princeton. And, he describes the 1916 Rising as, passionate and mystical. Now, he calls it unfortunate because it interfered with the Home Rule journey, which would have been a passion of Shane Leslie and Fodor Fay. But even calling the 1916 Easter Rising passionate and mystical was a pretty revolutionary stance in Princeton at the time, where the 1916 Rising would have been perceived as a pro-German activity. Albeit America hadn't entered the war, Anglo establishment would have, was obviously very anti-German and working to try and get America to enter the war on the side of the Allies. So he went on this, amazing journey, and Fitzgerald immersed himself in the Irish question, the Irish political situation. And in his review of The Celt in the World, he specifically references Patrick Pearse and Plunkett, both who were executed after the Easter Rising. And those names weren't mentioned by Leslie in his book, The Celt in the World. So, it's clear that Fitzgerald is embedded in the Irish question. He also, interestingly, in his notebooks, he makes reference to the death of Captain Willie Redmond, who was killed at the Battle of Messine Ridge. And, that's, the fact that he noted that is quite interesting. And Captain Redmond would have been obviously an avid Home Rule supporter and very good friend of Shane Leslie. So Fitzgerald had gone on this immersion, literary immersion, political immersion, personal immersion, describing himself as an Irishman. And that changed after the war. And he specifically references in This Side of Paradise that transition from immersion in the Irish situation to, he describes he says the Irish Republic lacks dignity. And in the book, I show, which for me was a revelation as well, that Fitzgerald was in Boston at the end of June 1919 when De Valera was there, when De Valera was speaking at Fenway Park in front of 50,000 people. And in This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald writes that Father Darcy, who is Father Fay, the real life character, saw De Valera in Boston and believed the Irish Republic lacked dignity because the reception committee with De Valera had the audacity to put their arms around the Irish president. Now, it seems like a small thing, but to Fitzgerald, it was a big thing, in particular because Father Fay had died 6 months earlier. It wasn't Father Fay who had seen Eamon de Valera. It was actually Fitzgerald himself. And this was such a big event that contemporaneously he added that new scene after seeing De Valera into This Side of Paradise. I mean, so this was an important thing to him. He also, on the 12th of July, 1919, Edward Carson makes a speech in Belfast, to which Justice Cohalan in New York replies. Fitzgerald is aware of both these events and writes in This Side of Paradise that Amory Blaine was tired of the rancid accusations of Edward Carson and Justice F. Cohalan, and effectively that his Celtic pillars were no longer part of his makeup, and he had finished with the Irish question. So, we've gone on this journey of shame to embracing to now rejection of his these Celtic pillars as he described them. And we go on to the next phase of his life after the success of this side of paradise, which was an extremely surprising success. And certainly his publisher didn't expect it to be such a success. To his next book, The Beautiful and Damned, where his description of Ireland is of his Irish characters is quite negative. It's stereotypical, and you can see he has changed in his attitude.
Over this evolution that he has had with his Irish heritage, would it be fair to say that, I'm just going to use an example where a lot of the history that we go over on this podcast, a lot of times when we have authors on, for example, we had an author on recently who wrote about Irish Americans and Irish immigrants who served for the Union Army in the Civil War. And you will find that these Irish Americans, Irish immigrants, maybe didn't come into the Civil War as enlightened abolitionists, but over the course of the fight or over the course of the Civil War, they started to see a connection with Black Americans. There's the San Patricio in the Mexican-American War who actually started to fight with Mexico because they found that they had more in common with their the Mexican working class than with the officers in the United States Army. It feels like even when F. Scott Fitzgerald was embracing his Irishness, he was doing it almost as an exclusive thing, as he was seeing himself as still being better than others. He wasn't embracing the working class nature of being Irish. He was embracing Oscar Wilde and maybe the more what he would have viewed as enlightened side of Irish heritage.
Yes, and that's particularly true in the sense that Fitzgerald was an elitist. Fitzgerald was a snob, and he fell into the company of Father Fay and Shane Leslie, who only reinforced that aspect of him. And he certainly, that was a trigger for him when the perception became that the Celt was equal to the Teuton. And interestingly, Fitzgerald used to say he liked the underdog causes, and he had a particular attraction to the Confederacy through his father, and that continued. And the way the Irish question was sold to him in a way that the Irish question was also another underdog cause, and the Fay and Leslie, it's not just the Irishness, it's the Catholicism. So they brought an Eastern elitism, Catholicism. So for the first time, he saw Catholicism as, not dark and dank and, oppressive priests. He saw it as a worldly, intellectual, elitist position. So yeah, Fitzgerald, as an officer in the army, he couldn't relate to his working class men. For a brief period, he went working in St. Paul, and similarly, just couldn't relate. He was in a factory environment, and he just couldn't relate to the men. And to be fair to the guy, you kind of go, is it Fitzgerald's fault who he is, or is that the fault of nurture? His Irish mom with social aspirations, his Southern dad with carrying aspirations of breeding. He meets Father Fay and Shane Leslie, who impress on him elitist attitudes. So it's that kind of nature over nurture argument. But yeah, Fitzgerald, he describes the degenerate Italians and the illiterate Irish, his view on immigrants, was not favorable, and that comes out in The Great Gatsby as well, and some of his racial viewpoints, are very negative.
So I know that you dug up a great quote about baseball that I want you to get to before we finish this conversation. I know that you had mentioned it before we started recording here.
Well, one of the great kind of metaphors in The Great Gatsby is the fixing of the 1919 World Series, and it's something I covered in the Revolution at the Waldorf, from Harry Boland having noting the result of the game in his diary, and Fitzgerald addresses the fixing of the World Series through his character Mayor Wolfsheim. And Mayor Wolfsheim is based on the real-life Arnold Rothstein, who was a top crime boss, a Jewish mobster, and not just your average mobster. His nickname is the Brain. He's effectively the godfather of the Godfathers, and he was suspected of fixing the 1919 World Series. And Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, the narrator Nick Carraway asks Jay Gatsby, who is this Mayor Wolfsheim he's just met? And Gatsby says, he's the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. And Carraway is like, staggered. That's the word. He's actually staggered to hear this. And he describes that he finds it incredible that one man could interfere with the fate of 50 million people. And so it's not just, it's really a metaphor for the American pastime that, somebody would actually, do damage to that. It's a symbol of, change in American society. And interesting as well, that his characterization of Arnold Rothstein is quite an elegant man. And Fitzgerald characterizes Mayor Wolfsheim as a Jewish caricature. Again, it's not a pleasant description that Fitzgerald uses, which he had no need to do, because the character himself, had enough story and enough elegance to warrant just inclusion alone. The 1919 World Series, impacted across many aspects of American life, including, as we heard, Harry Boland, an Irish revolutionary, writes about it in his diary, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, in what is the great American novel of only 50,000 words, deems it important to include it as a symbol, for what was happening in America at the time.
So the book is Gatsby, Death of an Irishman, F. Scott Fitzgerald and His Search for Identity by Patrick O'Sullivan Greene. Patrick, where can somebody find this book?
The book is available in local bookstores. If they don't have the book, you can just ask them to order it. It's available online. My understanding, some of the American online stores, you can pre-order, but it won't be delivered until May or June, depending on the site. In the European online sites, it's available for order now. And I'm not sure if I mentioned, the publishers are Wordwell Books in Ireland, and if you Google Wordwell Books, you can order online directly for them, and they'll ship to America as well.
Absolutely. Patrick O'Sullivan Greene, it was great to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Rick.
I'm Rick Becker, and this has been episode 115 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.